So today we're going to be talking about transitioning to a self-performed service model. Little couple of notes, points of order about how the class will go. If you got a question, raise your hand, ask it, we'll call on you. If there was any kind of an emergency, the exits are right behind us, so just calmly and quickly leave the building that way. We're going to jump into a class that's a little different than what you might be used to when you come to these sorts of things. So when I've come to events like this, the class is like, speaker stands up and talks for an hour, and then the attendees leave and they remember about 10% of what they heard. What we hope to do is have a more interactive class. So we'll be calling on you guys for some interaction, okay? So be ready for that.
All right, so quick introduction. So I'm Shelby McCarty, the Imaging Director Service for the Midwest region for RENOVO. So basically what that is just the central third of the country. So fun fact about me, my original degree is in music education, and I taught middle school band for 6 years before I got into this. I went back and got an electronics certificate, started as a BMET 1 back in 2015 with Trimedics. Moved into a role with Philips Healthcare, did field service as an imaging guy on basically all the big iron and multi-vendor service. Moved into a national support role, went back into a supervisor role for a couple of years with Trimedics again, before landing my dream job here as the Director of Service for the Midwest. So been here for about 10 months, and as maybe you'll pick up in this, Keith and I have become like the stepbrothers who never were. So we have a lot of fun together. We've got a couple of other colleagues back there that do the same job as us, but looking forward to the class today.
Thanks, Shelby. So I'm Keith Hall. I'm also a Director of Service for Imaging. I support the western third of the United States. A little bit about my background. I've been doing biomed and imaging for the last about 25 years of my life. I went in the Army at the ripe young age of 19. About 10 years into my Army service, I had a choice to make. I could either remain a soldier and leading soldiers and do soldier stuff and road marches and shooting and all that, or I could take a more technical approach and try to remain technically relevant. And so at that decision point, I decided I would apply for, and I got selected to participate in a special program that the military has called the Training with Industry program. So I ended up going to the Philips Cleveland campus and wearing a Philips polo and teaching their CT repair course and taking a bunch of other courses there for about a year. My follow-on assignment was 5 years out in Tracy, California, where we specifically focused on imaging. I ran kind of the global CT repair program for the Army for our mobile CTs that we could deploy rapidly anywhere. During that time, I also got selected to participate in the DoD's MRI initiative, where we put 3 mobile MRIs at the point of injury in Afghanistan. So it was a partnership with the NFL and the Navy and the Joint Department of Defense. So we went into Oud Ireland in the Netherlands and facilitated building these MRIs into the mobile trailers with Philips. We flew them into Afghanistan on the big Russian Antonov aircraft, which, to my knowledge, had never been done before with MR. We installed them, and then 2 years later, I was back in the region as the regional support specialist for imaging. And at that time, the Department of Defense had determined the MRIs that we're getting on site are no different than the ones that we're getting 18 to 36 hours later back in Landstuhl, Germany. So this is an expensive program that yields no benefits. We're going to close it down. So then I went and uninstalled those same 3 MRIs. Follow-on assignments were both in leadership type capacities. I entered retirement in 2020, came to work for RENOVO as the account director at University of Utah. And 2 years after that, I progressed into the role I'm in today. So, thank you.
All right, so kind of going over the overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some factors to consider. So if we're going to transition from an OEM-centric model, so what that means is if you're using the OEM, basically farming out all your imaging equipment straight to the OEMs for service contracts, we're going to talk about what that looks like, the pros and cons of the OEM model, Then we're going to talk about pros and cons of a self-perform model. So that can be in a couple of different kind of solutions. Like we can do what you would call, most people call an in-house program. You also have the independent service organizations or third-party companies that can also do this for you. We're going to talk about cost of ownership. So like a cost of ownership of a lifetime of a piece of equipment. And then kind of our experience with a recent change that we made internally that allowed us to kind of go down this path. And then a little bit of reference material just for common knowledge and service documentation that is much more widely available today than it ever was. So.
Thank you, Shelby. So some of the factors to consider are service flexibility. I want to call on Mr. Novak, Chris Novak. Can you help us understand what are some factors when we're talking about OEM versus self-support or self-perform? What are some service flexibility considerations we're talking about here?
Hours, availability of staff.
Availability of staff, okay.
You're immediately available versus calling somebody in and having to wait 4 hours to get the system up and running.
Yep.
The type of coverage you might have on the system, PM, full service, the use of a third party, where you're getting the parts from.
Good. You talked about a lot of different factors, right? So response time is another one. So let me ask Kyle, do you think, in your experience, do you think it's, who's going to get there first? The OEM that has to potentially travel or somebody who's already in the facility? Okay.
Even a third party that's not OEM, like me.
Even a third party that's not the OEM? Yeah, sometimes that's true. Some of those factors depend on the staffing levels that the OEM has for the region, right? And trends that we see are that OEMs are thinning out the herd. They have fewer and fewer service engineers to cover more and more territory and more devices, right? One engineer, we're managing 20 to 30 million. I just want to make sure it gets recorded. So I'm saying it again for the, okay. Part selection and availability. In the back, I can't read your name tag. What do you think about parts and availability, OEM versus doing it yourself?
OEM, you're definitely going to get the right part, get the support of finding the right part also. Doing it yourself, you always have that chance.
That's a great point. You said when you use the OEM, you're going to get the right part. I would say you're likely to get the right part. You're more likely to get the right part, right? But what happens when the OEM has that part on global back order, right? In a different part of the world. Can the OEM go to a major parts supplier and say, we want to buy this part and then use it and then put it in? Does that ever happen? So what is the impact to the customer? They got to wait, right?
You got to add in the age of the equipment still available for that.
We're getting to it. And no, I appreciate it, Roger. You like great minds think alike, right? So life cycle extension beyond end of service, end of life, end of support, end of life, right? So the OEM tells you, here's your CT scanner that we sold you for $1.5 million. And in 10 years, they say, hey, that CT scanner is no longer viable. You can't use it anymore. It's no longer supportable. We're not going to come out when you call us for service. We're no longer going to sell you the parts because you need to buy a new one. It seems like that might be a driver.
Chris, you had something?
Yeah, just to go back to the part selection. One thing that's a misnomer as well is that OEMs, you're always getting a new part coming from the OEM.
Yeah, you're right.
That is not the case.
You're totally right.
You know, when an OEM goes out to fix something and replaces a part, they send that old part back to be reworked and repaired and put it back on the shelf for the next customer. So I think that's a big misnomer that folks have to understand. Because they'll use that as a selling point to the customer.
So that's exactly. I had one recently where we had a GE HD Revolution where we had to replace a liquid bearing tube and the heat exchanger was also bad. So the heat exchanger they sent out came out. The box was the correct part number on the box. They opened up the box and it was the wrong part inside.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
but-
we're going to dig into that a little bit more as we look at like the actual pros and cons of each type of model here. And there's definitely pros and cons to both models. So this is definitely in no way, hey, we're here to bash the OEM, because there's definitely a role for those guys. But we feel strongly that a self-perform model can be of great value. So.
Right, customer satisfaction is another factor that we want to consider. Cost and value, they're not the same thing, not always, right? Lower cost doesn't always mean greater value. So some of the factors that we consider are cost versus value. And I'll kick it over.
All right, so we're going to talk about the OEM-centric model here. So probably most of you have been in some sort of capacity where you farm things out straight to the OEM, or whether you sign point-of-sale agreements for long-term service or extended warranties, and the pros and cons of that. So somebody give me a pro of a OEM-centric model. What's a good thing about this model? Yep, for sure. So the cost, and we're going to kind of break this down in a little bit, looking at that cost of ownership over a lifetime of equipment or a useful life of equipment. So we'll look at that in a couple of slides. But what about software and upgrades? This is becoming a real hot topic in the industry because OEMs are baking in software upgrades and hardware upgrades into, and what do you think of that? Is that a challenge on the other side? Or is that a pro for the OEM side? Yeah. What about the capped financial risk? A lot of people like to see, get a service contract for $100,000 a year, pretty much know that's where you're going to be. There's not going to be ups and downs based on if you know, outside of kind of hours, usually, obviously depending on what hours you pick in your service level agreements, but and then capped financial risk, like you were saying, they can't figure something out, like they're probably eventually going to have to make it right? So, and then going back to whoever said it, the service key thing. Service keys, the proprietary service keys are limiting factors for the third party or for independent groups or for in-house. You're not going to be able to, usually you're not going to be able to buy a Class M, 7, whatever those keys are. There's ways to diagnose, but you just don't have that access. So what else? Some cons on the OEM model. Somebody said cost.
Right, and so how do we define that, right? Typically, the way I think about it is that an upgrade changes a function of the device or the operation of the device. It enables a new feature that wasn't previously there. Yep, okay.
Or an update or FMI or some of those things are more security related or some.
But you get those regardless.
Yeah, right, you do.
You get those
So
regardless.
the safety related things, sometimes even when you purchase it as a you know, add-on service. So typically especially now with that model being more widespread, we're seeing it not necessarily in the service related, but it's kind of just baked in as a line item. So you've got the service level agreement and then you see the little upgrade, whatever it is, if a lot of times whenever you have those service contracts, they're going to be a lot less than if you were to try to buy them outright. We're going to kind of look at that in a little bit, but going back to that operations versus capital. I mean, we talk about what happened during COVID or right after COVID, like capital was gone for a while. And I mean, just, organizations all the time talking about the capital is just frozen for years. And now what happens when we're, all these years later, you've got capital that hasn't been used for years. And now we got a whole fleet of systems that are now all behind. So definitely seeing, and it, in my mind for the OEM, it's a pretty smart proposition because the capital dollars are much harder to get approved, while operation dollars, in my experience, is easier to just push through. So when they're rolling it in, hey, it's a great pro for the OEM to have upgrades built into service, in my opinion. So any other cons before we kind of keep going? Not necessarily something that you have to worry about so much if you have an OEM centric model. So if you've got a fleet of CTs and you're farming them out straight to the OEM, it's kind of on them to have guys trained and to have people capable of working on them. So it's not so much that you may end up with someone that isn't trained on that, which is not really supposed to happen. I was a former OEM guy, and it was a big slap on the wrist, no to go, but it happens, and especially if it's a down system. Do you want a body or do you not want a body sometimes? So, and I challenge you, the earlier comment about your parts, OEM new means it's new, or OEM means it's new. The same thing goes with, you go to an OEM training and you're trained, that doesn't mean you're good at it. Like, I went through a bunch of OEM trainings and came back and were like, I don't remember anything, you know, like you get on your first cath lab PM, you're like, oh. Anyway, so that's what they're selling though. So, yeah. So let's move on to looking at a self-perform model.
Yep, so this is the antithesis of what he was talking about. We were talking about pros and cons of OEM with him. We're going to talk about pros and cons for self-perform with me. So show of hands, who can think of a pro of doing the service yourself or without the OEM as much? Yeah. Time, what do you expand on that? Somebody's already on site, so it's faster to walk from the basement where Biomed usually is, or wherever the imaging shop is, walk up the stairs and engage with the customer in a matter of minutes, right? Okay, somebody else? Yes, sir. Cost savings, that's good. So, because oftentimes you can service it yourself for a lot less, and we'll go through an exercise like Shelby said to demonstrate that. Yes, sir. I like that. I also like that in a self-perform model, you take the onus of managing service calls off of the clinical staff and you put it on maintenance management staff. You take the burden of documentation for audit readiness off of the clinical staff. You don't need to be the ones that hold the service reports and have them ready for Joint Commission or DNV. This maintenance management staff and maintenance teams should be able to do that. And so that when there's follow-up needed with the OEM, we're not relying on the rad tech to call the OEM and say, hey, what's the status of my parts? That's what the maintenance team would be doing in a self-perform model. So it's beneficial. That's right. So when the OEM says, hey, we're not supporting this anymore, you can't get parts there. You can't get a tech to come out and service it. When you self-support, there's a vast market for third-party parts. Even new OEM parts are available oftentimes for devices that are end of service life. You just gotta know where to look and where to partner. So I'm gonna keep moving because we're gonna run out of time if we don't, but it's great discussion so far. Let's talk about training. How does training shift? If you're a maintenance manager in your organization, how do you shift your thinking about how you want to support your imaging install base when you're doing a self-perform? Training's got to be one of them, right? Does anybody want to shout out any resources they know of that are out there for training? RSTI is one. What is it? All parts. Let somebody else answer. Try imaging. Yeah.
You got
Probo. Yeah.
You've got AUS.
And depending on your the system that you're in, the OEM training is potentially available to you, right? Okay. Parts availability we talked about, response time we've talked about, and overall downtime. In my experience, in a self-perform model, oftentimes our teams are able to return a system to proper operation faster than the OEM because we can get the parts overnight immediately. We have teams on site already that can diagnose and get it happens. It doesn't happen every time, but it happens.
Not quite infinite, but there is a gigantic selection of aftermarket or sometimes even new parts. And then talking about what you were talking about with OEM parts and the moniker that they're better or new all the time. You've got a 10-year-old CT, the OEM's not sending you a new part. And then when you're not tied to one source of failure with the OEM only being able to get their parts, you've got 18 different parts vendors. It's a lot easier to find the part and get the right part for you. So we're gonna walk over to this cost of ownership exercise. So we're gonna look at, in an OEM model, what does it look like to purchase a piece of equipment, counting the first year of warranty, looking at 9 additional years of service. So in my experience, 10 years of useful life on a high-end imaging device. You could probably go, you know, a couple years either way, but we'll just go with 10 years. Look at the cost of service and upgrades, and then get a total cost of ownership after 10 years, and then look at it for both models. Yes, sir. Oh. Okay. So equipment purchase. So what we're gonna look at is a dual source CT in this example. Equipment purchase. Again, some of these are just kind of rough figures, but we're gonna go $2 million on a dual source CT here. So this in an OEM model, if you sign point of sale agreements, typically what we've seen is that they will give you 5% discount on the purchase price, give or take again. So our yearly service, this number is quite substantial. I know that this is accurate data. So your yearly service is $268,000 a year without upgrades for this dual source CT. Upgrades. You buy the upgrades a couple of times in this model. Not too bad. 30,000 for a couple of upgrades. They do them over a couple of little blocks of time, right? So after 10 years, your service with upgrades, 2.442 million. We factor in the equipment purchase into that. We're gonna look at $4.442 million after 10 years if you sign point of sale agreements with the OEM with your purchase. So now let's go and look at, oh, sorry, cost reduction, obviously. So now let's look at the self-perform model. Again, if you're not signing point of sale agreements, we've seen 5%. So we're gonna bump that up, 2.1 million. You're not gonna save as much up front, but there's the cost there. Yearly service, again, probably some room for margin, 140,000 a year for service, whether you're in-house or if you're using an independent group, or but that's what we've seen. Upgrades, we're pretty conservative in our estimate here, because if you're not getting it through your service, you're not going to get the discount that you're getting through the OEM type of agreement. So we built in a pretty hefty upgrade budget right here. So if we go yearly service and upgrades, we see 1.46 million. Then we added on to the slightly inflated purchase price, we see 3.56 million. Over a 10-year life, you're saving almost half your CT. So this also leaves you room for a number of things: catastrophic failures, multiple tube failures. You've got a dual source CT. Sometimes you know, the second tube is going to go out sometimes. So you might have both of them go out. So again, room for catastrophic failure. So I think you can see when we're talking about cost and value here, in our experience, the value in the self-perform model. And then if you're an in-house group, what can this do? You could shift this, all that savings over the time back to your capital. It may be a little bit tricky with finance, but I think there's a lot of room to do a lot of flexible things with all that savings. So, yes, sir. Ready?
Yep. Any questions about that previous slide? Pretty good, right? Okay, in our experience, so we decided to take a look at a specific modality. And so what we're going to share with you is how we went through that process. We picked one modality. In this case, it was a major mammo manufacturer. And we decided we wanted to stop using an OEM-centric model and start self-performing. Okay.
Okay. So kind of high level. So whenever you're going to shift to a different service model from an OEM-centric to a self-perform model, what are the things that you kind of got to do? First, obviously, Keith already told you, we developed like a scope, what we're gonna do. We picked this product. You're not gonna probably go out and change your whole program overnight. So in this example, we did one. So what would be our next step? What we need to do? When we were developing this, what we did first is looked at our resources. What do we have internally? What do we have externally? There's a great group of vendors down there in that hallway that have a lot of capabilities, whether it's technical support, whether it's parts, whether it's training. And what we did was we put, in fact, in our example, we took like 8 different vendors for Mammo, and we put those resources together. We put the training together. We put the parts together. We actually got maps of where all their field service guys were, put them together on a map so that we could service plan after, if we're not able to do it or we have gaps in our coverage, where can we turn next? And then next to take care of our customers here. So after we mapped that out, we looked at our internal staffing, what makes the most sense to train. Maybe if I have 1 Mammo in this facility, maybe this model's not right for that. But if we have, 15 in a regional area, so what we did was looked at that, took the first wave of it was we took 8 of our engineers, got them into a training session with just our employees, sent them to training, and then with all the other things that we did with our model, we looked at all those things together, published our service plan, had meetings with our customers to make sure that we're all on the same page. Like someone was saying, you don't want to change your service plan and not tell your customer, your end user, what we're doing here, because they're used to seeing their engineer, and then the next day, all of a sudden somebody's different. It's probably not going to go too well. So, sorry, I went ahead. So our reference material, as I said, I just kind of showed you what we did with some of the vendors and some of their field service engineers. And then we also, with our supply chain partner, looked at all the assets they had, and combined, we developed this secondary support plan so that we had much, we don't want a single point of failure, essentially. We have our engineer, and then if that doesn't work, what do we do? So we developed those other things behind that. So any questions on this so far?
Lessons learned. So along the way, we made mistakes. We didn't get everything perfectly right up front. We're humans. So one of the things that I will tell you is that a lack of communication is easily the most preventable falter point. If you don't communicate clearly to everybody and you're not thinking about every little thing that you need to communicate out, sometimes you can miss a step on communication. And if you do that, then that's an easy stumbling block to trip over. So give good focused thought to how do we need to make sure that everybody knows about this. And we did a lot of things right? Shelby did a great job. He drafted up these maps and this support document. We sent it out to our engineers. We had meetings. We talked to our engineers about it. We talked to our customers about it. One of the things that we learned was about the training. We could increase the amount of training as it pertained to help me out with verbiage here.
Just like a more in-depth, more advanced level training. So we had like some general, training on it, but what we've learned is maybe it would be helpful after a period of time to go even deeper. So some of the OEMs and some of the other third-party companies that train will have a proficient class, maybe an advanced class. So that
Thank you.
doesn't necessarily exist in this Mammo market. And so we've actually discussed that about maybe having a secondary, more advanced class.
Thanks for helping me with that. Keys to success, I think I already touched on communication. That was something I highlighted that we maybe had a misstep here or there, but overall, I would say 98% communication and focusing on that really helped us be successful. The other thing is getting buy-in. So when we came up with this idea at our level, we needed to make sure that we had buy-in from not only our managers, but also from our C-suite, from our company, as well as from the stakeholders at the customer sites that we support. So making sure that everybody understands what the plan is and you get that buy-in will really lead to success.
Is there anybody in here from that has MAMO under their purview? So like, what would you think? So like, give me some of your concerns if we were to gonna bring this to you and talk to you about this. Your example with that device, how many of those devices did they sell in the last 10 years? I can't even imagine. Like, the market share's there, so there's a lot of those out there. So what does that also mean? There is a lot of those on the secondary market that have just as high capability to repair their own parts, to have all the accessories for those things. So I would say to your comment about that you're not convinced that they wouldn't be functional, they would be highly functional, and likely you wouldn't see any service gaps, especially with your example, because it's such a market share. Like, anytime if you're talking about something that only a few people had, it would probably be more of a challenge to go to something like that, to that model. Yeah, Chris?
And as an ISO, how did you help your customer comply with MQSA?
I mean, just working through that process. All the companies that do this are very much entrenched in MQSA, so they know what it takes. They know the regulatory aspect of all of it, and they're experts. A lot of those guys came from the OEM too, so they just know.
Yeah, we didn't bring in any Bob's Biomed Garage service providers, right? We made sure that competency is something that we track, and we do vendor performance analysis and all that stuff as an ISO company. So that's in more direct answer to your question is we vetted, right? You asked what did we do to make sure, and I'm telling you, we check the source of labor that we're receiving to make sure that they're qualified, competent.
And those groups that do MAMO, they know. You don't mess with a MAMO without getting, yeah, everybody knows MAMO is very, very strict with regulations and all of that stuff. So those vendors that do it at a high level already know all that stuff. So
Go ahead.
I was just say, while some people don't consider MAMO a heavy iron imaging device, in my experience, like, it's right there with CT, cath lab, and MAMO is like the most stressful on the end user, and for it's just a stressful environment because of all the implications. If the machine's down, it delays the biopsy, it delays the ultrasound, it might delay the all that stuff that just spirals real, and then the regulatory, so it's all really stressful, especially on you guys. So what do you think?
I was going to say that's a great segue to our next slide for the maintainers in the room.
So this is just something we put together because over the years, this has not always been the case. The AIAT, which is your and everyone's right to assemble, install, adjust, and test, is an FDA requirement. So we have not always been so lucky to be able to get pretty high levels of documentation that we have today. So this makes everything easier, whether you're an in-house group or a third party. You pretty well can go out and find the documentation on these devices. And again, they may not be the highest level with the different class, of service keys and service documentation, but they're good. And so this is just some of the online portals for documentations, and you can, even some really old equipment, you can still get documentation up to some of the newest stuff. So even though it's a challenge sometimes to maybe get training on the newest of new models, we'll go a quick review. I think we got a minute.
Yeah, we got a little bit of time. So first we told you what we were gonna tell you, then we told it to you, and now we're gonna tell you what we told you.
You
Right.
can't tell he's an Army guy, right?
We talked about some of the factors to consider. We talked about the pros and cons between OEM and self-perform. Talked about the cost of ownership, which that was to me kind of the most striking, like the large cost of ownership difference between just by changing your service model. We talked about our experience, how we kind of developed the program from the idea of it through the planning stages, through generating documents, communicating it out, and then implementing it. And we showed you a slide that has some references that can hopefully be helpful to you. So at this time, I want to save enough time at the end here. It's 9:50. So this is the time for questions and continuing that open discussion.